Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcs, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 2, I'm going to be talking to 8 South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today we chat with Tashan Mehta, the author of The Liar's Weave, which features astrology taken very seriously, a teenage boy with too much power, and India of the 1920s. Tashan's second book, Mad Sisters of Esi, will be released later this year. We discuss Italo Calvino, relearning how to write, plurality in storytelling, the complexity of family relationships, the consequences of superpowers, and poisonous Edens. You can follow Tashan on Twitter @Tashan Mehta. Hi, Tashan. Thank you so much for joining us today on ARCS.
Lovely to be here.
And to kind of kick things off, could you tell us a bit about your journey as a writer? How did you get started? Did you always want to be one?
Unfortunately, yes, I did always want to be one. It's such a cliched answer, isn't it? When I was 8 years old, but honestly, when I was 8 years old, I was reading Enid Blyton. And I think I remember I was sitting on a couch right by a window. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what I want to do. I think I wrote my first full short story at about 13. And then I just kept honing my craft. I did my undergraduate at Warwick University, which was in English literature and creative writing. And that was eye-opening and that was challenging. And then I graduated. And the dissertation that I had done for my final project at Warwick was The Liar's Weave, the first chapter of The Liar's Weave. And so then I came back and I wrote it. I wrote it across 2 years and it got published by Juggernaut, which is an independent publisher here. And since then, it's not been a straight journey at all, although I really wish it had been. But it's been numerous ups and downs. This industry changes, you change, everything is just smoke and mirrors. So it's been interesting navigating that and understanding that more deeply.
Did you work on anything else after that, or was it straight to this new book that you have coming out?
No, not at all. So I actually had a 2-book deal with Juggernaut, and just try as I might, and I really tried, that book would not come to life. It just would not come to life. I actually have an article in Scrollin about finding a new beginning for that book and believing it was the version that would save me, and it was not the version that would save me. And while I was battling with the second novel, which is the dead novel now, the idea for a book that will be published soon in October called Mad Sisters of Esi came to me. It came to me rather romantically, actually. I was on a flight back from Delhi and feeling very sorry for myself and this second book that wouldn't work. And this idea came to me like a full 3 pages, just absolutely fully written, just kind of channeled themselves through me. And it was about a boy in a tower looking for a God machine. And it just kind of became the beginning of what would become the Mad Sisters of Esi.
Conversely, I actually think that's a really encouraging story, because I think a lot of people assume that once you've written something and it goes out into the world, it's so much easier to write the second one. And I don't think that's true.
It's not true at all. It's much, much harder to write the second one. And honestly, it was brutally hard to write the third one, which is Mad Sisters of Esi. It was much harder to write that one because I had to reteach myself how to write, basically, and how my process is being conceptualized. And I'm on the next book now, and I'm doing that whole thing all over again. I'm better, and I hope to God I'm slightly wiser, but it is a question of just consistently teaching yourself how to write the next book from scratch.
Were there any particular books or media that really influenced your storytelling and that you've kind of built on in the years later after you've started writing?
Massively. So I think when I first started, it was the very simple Enid Blyton, Magic Faraway Tree. God, I love those books. They were so good. They just had this deep sense of wonder to them. So I think they started with that. And obviously, as I moved on, there were writers I admired, like Tolstoy with Anna Karenina. But I think a writer that was definitely my writer and transformative for me was Italo Calvino, specifically Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Because I think, gosh, it's just such a good book, just fundamentally down to its core. He's just made something that's taken the philosophical and the living, like the alive and the breathing. He's just interknitted them so utterly and easily and seamlessly. And he's managed to do it with sentences, in translation, sentences that are near perfect. I have no clue how he manages to pull this off. And I think because he's a fabulous writer, because he uses the imaginary and the wondrous and all sorts of quests and tales to talk about very real ways of living and very real ways of looking at the world, he spoke very intimately to me, because it was the first time I saw the fabulous not as a distraction, but as a very clear method to kind of prise open the lid to how we live and peer underneath it and see how everything works.
It's also such an interesting book because it's a very different perspective, right? It's between these two kind of iconic characters having a conversation that spans years and over travels, and you are not completely sure whether it's actually fantastical or it's meant to be real, and it kind of ignores boundaries in a way which is really interesting.
It's utterly stunning. He does this. It's both things at once, I find, with Calvino. It is both real and both imagined, both philosophical and both actually essentially living, both past historical tale of fabulous mythical land and immediate everyday living and how we cope with memory. It's just all of time collapsed into a very singular text. And he has this line, I'm going to read it to you because I think it's absolutely stunning. Only in Marco Polo's accounts was Kublai Khan able to discern, through the walls and towers destined to crumble, a tracery of a pattern so subtle it could escape the termites' gnawing. And it's a line that comes when Kublai Khan's thinking about his empire and thinking about how everything will be lost to dust. But all that lasts is this, the essential foundation in how we relate to the world, understand the world, cope with the world, and reform the world. And the fact that Calvino has, in the opening of his book, literally summed up what makes his book so utterly brilliant. It's just quintessentially Calvino, and you only get it on like the third reread or something like that. And I think what I just love in Calvino's perspective is that he looks through the fabulous and through the adventurous and the mythical and these things that hold very old-fashioned allure for the children that we were. He looks very much at how the human brain comprehends the world and copes with the world, how the moment meaning is solidified into a single textual phrase, it's boring. We need the plethora of option. We need variance. We need newness. He's just consistently looking at that in all forms, to our desire, to our memory, to our pattern making, in all different angles. He's managed to do it in a way where each city is interesting. It's just crazy to me.
And what do you think you've drawn from his book and his writing in general with regard to your own?
So I think one was definitely these plural ways of seeing, and this is particularly with Invisible Cities, but also on If a Winter's Night a Traveler, right? There's so many different ways. Each of his chapters, just a different way of writing and just a different way of looking. Calvino just has so much fun setting everything on fire and doing whatever he wants. And then I think naturally a question that I kept coming back to in my own writing is, how do different forms provide different ontological stances? So does a diary look in the same way a dream looks? Does it look the same way as a letter looks, or a narration looks, or a soliloquy looks, or a play looks, or a book looks? I'm just trying to find how all those different forms can lend us different ways of seeing. But I think on a very, very fundamental level, he's affected my writing. And what I love about his writing is he's managed to take very real adult human concepts of deep philosophical questions we essentially ponder in existential crises, and connect it back to the wonder and the joy you had as a child of like exotic lands and tales and travel and fabulousness and this feeling of, touching a fairy tale, basically, like magic right at your fingertips. And he's managed to pull all of that in while saying that the way in which we interact with the world is very much connected to that. It's not separated from that.
I think if we're left to our own devices, we'll be talking about Calvino for several hours. But I do want to talk about Mad Sisters of Esi and The Liar's Weave. Could you kind of summarize the Mad Sisters of Esi for people who haven't heard about it yet?
Mad Sisters of Esi is essentially at its heart a tale of two sisters searching for their sense of belonging and trying to understand where they come from. That's a very simple line to say it's a book that spans across 3 universes, has a Whale of Babel, has a Festival of Madness, features a museum of collective memory made of song. It's essentially one of the most plural works I could think of, and one of the most mad works I could think of. And honestly, I love it so deeply from the bottom of my heart. It is a book that arrived in my world and then spent 3 years teaching me how to write it. And I've done the best that I can, the talent that I can. It just has a core to it that is wholly living and wholly outside of myself. I feel like one of those shepherds, like ushering something into the world rather than a creator of a world. So I love that book. And I think along the way, it taught me a lot about what kind of stories I want to write, but also what kind of writer I am. And I think in those sort of ways, I owe it a debt I will never forget down the line.
That is the best sales pitch I've heard for a book in a long time. So now I'll invite you to do a reading from the book.
Yes, absolutely. So just to set a bit of context, this is from the section called Esi. Essentially, the book circles round to the tale of the Mad Sisters of Esi. And so just to give you a bit more of a context before I start reading, we are in a place, I won't tell you too much of a place, but this grandfather called Hua has got home this wild child called Wissa into this colony. And Magali is his other granddaughter. And Magali is trying to cope with the fact that she doesn't really appreciate Wissa there and doesn't really understand why Wissa is there. And so in order to try and make peace with her, she takes her to this ritual where essentially the children go out into the forest and they climb this huge wall with an absolutely massive mango tree on it. And Wissa is supposed to be a skywalker extraordinaire, which means in the market before she came to the colony, she did acrobatic tricks essentially. And so this story is presented as a memory, and that's where we open. So, beginning of the extract. We are back in the stone structure. Magali is whispering to Wissa in a low, urgent murmur. Only go as far as you can. Don't show off. Most children don't get beyond the first third of the wall, so if you go higher, you will earn their respect. You have to come down. Don't forget that. No tricks. This isn't a Skywalker performance. Wissa is not listening. She's looking over Magali's shoulder at the children staring at her. One of them sticks out their tongue. Wissa hisses. The girl scampers. Wissa, Magali whispers furious. Listen to me. She won't, but she nods anyway. She's occupied with something we have not yet seen. And now Magali is uneasy. We sense it. Is Wissa nervous? Surely not. She has performed more daring feats at the market, jumped from trapezes at the top of thin bamboo poles. The other children are not as good as Jin. Some reach the main root cluster but give up soon after. Others fumble in the beginning of the wall itself, mistaking shadows for crevices, placing their weight in unreliable holds. Only one falls, from not too high, but his ankle is beneath him, and you can hear the crunch in the hush. He cries into his friend's shoulder as they carry him out. Then it is Wissa's turn, and she walks to the wall in a collective hush. She looks up but doesn't climb. 1 second, 2. The children don't say anything. You give the climber their space. 10 seconds, 11. A murmur. 13 seconds, 14. And Wissa glances back towards Magali quickly, involuntary, and then it is so obvious. Magali cannot believe her stupidity. Wissa has been lying. No one has actually seen her perform Skywalker tricks in the colony, not even by accident. The only witness is Wissa herself. Crazy, strange, talkative Wissa. And now she's looking at Magali panicked, who jolts forward without thinking to get between Wissa and the wall. She's filled with a protectiveness she cannot understand, It is a desperate urge to keep this ridiculous girl safe. But Wissa is already climbing. She's terrible. Her feet don't synchronize with her hands, and she places her toes in all the wrong places. Thrice she falls, saving herself by scrambling for a protruding weed or raking her fingers along the stone until she finds a hold. In the beginning, the children murmur, but as she keeps climbing, the murmurs change to jeers. By the time she is 1/3 up the wall, the children are laughing among themselves. So this is the famous Wissa, Skywalker extraordinaire. Magali shrinks into herself. Wissa keeps going up past the 1/3 point, slowly, carefully, now touching the cluster of roots. The children have quietened. The game has changed. Jin is whispering in Magali's ear, "Get her down, she'll kill herself." But Magali is poised with tension, terrified anything she says will disrupt Wissa's concentration and cause her to fall. When Wissa grips a wet root and transfers her weight to her hand, the crowd inhales as one. When that grip begins to slip, Wissa's legs still swimming in the air, trying to find purchase. Some children look away. Others bury their nails into skin. Magali doesn't look away. Wissa's toes find a crevice just as her hand slips off the root, and she is saved, but barely. She keeps going. No one is laughing now. Madness scents the air, and the children are drunk on it. She is high, higher than most of the others now, this awkward, fumbling child. In fact, she's only a few feet away from Jin's colored mark. It is there in front of her, so close. Wissa pauses at the start of a branch, wiping sweat from her eyes. She's shaking, the involuntary shudders of her fearful body. Just a bit further, Wissa. It's only a voice at first, but it becomes a crescendo. Each child is suddenly Wissa, staring at something impossible that is now within reach, and they shout for her to seize it. "Come on, Wissa, almost there. Reach." Wissa is inching slowly along the branch, reaching out her fingers, and she has done it. She is a Jin's mark on her first try, this mad girl with golden courage. Jin looks like he has swallowed lemons. And in the whooping and the hysteria and Magali's crumbling relief, "She's alive, sing to Esi." They don't notice something. Wissa is still going. She's crawling past the mark towards the end of the branch, following offshoots slowly, so slowly to get to the other branches and climb higher. "Wissa," Magali says, her voice firm and urgent. "That's far enough, come down." Wissa ignores her. Up beyond what any child would sensibly reach for, and no one is cheering now. The madness has fermented, and danger is all anyone can taste. Fall now, and she dies. Wissa stops. She's at a branch with no offshoots. The only way to climb higher is to jump to another branch. It is ridiculous. She would need to stand, balance, cover the gap. She won't dare, Magali tells herself. But Wissa is trying to stand, wobbling as she does so. "Wissa killed her," Magali shouts. She lifts the lamp to her face so Wissa can see her clearly. She is furious and utterly, utterly terrified. Wissa smiles. Magali says, "Don't you dare." Wissa jumps.
That was really lovely. Thank you so much. Could you tell us a bit about how this story came together? You mentioned that you kind of had a bolt of inspiration while you were on a flight, but that was obviously one small piece of the patchwork.
So I think it evolved across the course of 3 to 4 years. This book has gone through 5 different versions. So I think it started out as like cyberpunk, and finally it's ended up in literary fantasy. And it's gone through 24 drafts. And I think a large part of why it took so long and why I was so inefficient is because I was teaching myself how to write. So I think that bolt of inspiration came to me, and I wrote out a novella, and then I thought of how to expand that novella. And then one of the characters in that novella obviously needed their own backstory. And that's how Esi was created. And I think once Esi was created and once Wissa came on the scene, this novel just exploded. It just changed in shape, form, structure. The book has finally ended on a circular structure. So it starts at one point and it ends at the same point, but it isn't a circle, it's a spiral. So even though we return to the same point, we return different at a different plane, essentially, which I love, which gives me great joy. And the final structure of it is it's got the core story and then each story on either side of it, sort of like the rings of a tree or a Russian doll, essentially. So I think it took its time becoming the book that it needed to become. And one of the things that I think was extremely important for me as a writer is I wrote a draft. The 21st draft was the draft that I thought was the best draft in the history of the universe. And I sent it out to beta readers, these people that I love who are very smart and very wonderful. And every single one of them wrote back to me and said, it's wonderful, it's great, we love you, we can't understand a word. We have no clue what you've written. And so I think that was hugely transformative to me because I'm a developmental editor in my day job. And so what I had to essentially do then is gut the whole thing and start from scratch to write a reader-friendly draft that took the person from point A to point Z as cleanly and as easily as possible. And I love this draft because it was 140,000 words when I was done, but I wrote it in 2 months because I just knew the story so well by that point. I could genuinely sit down and write it in the way they do in the movies, where you've got a drink on one side and you start at the first line and you end at the end and you say the end, which I find hilarious. But yeah, I think that was a really huge learning curve, that you can create something truly beautiful to yourself, but create it for only one mind to understand it. And that's your mind. And that doesn't work at all.
I think it actually takes a great deal of courage to receive that feedback. I mean, however kindly it was given, but at the same time being told, okay, we didn't understand, you're going to have to start over. I mean, I would be miserable if I heard that.
Oh, I was very miserable. I did the full writer tantrum thing where you feel really sad and you're like, no one understands me. What is the world? It's a phase we all go through with every book. There has to be the no one understands me phase where you feel really sad about what you've created. But then you get out of it and then you actually fix the problems, which was good.
And I also wanted to ask you about your world building, because I noticed this in The Liar's Weave. It's a very rich world that you've built. There's a lovely tangle of myth and magic that kind of underlies your work that I've read so far. So I wanted to ask if that's the case with Mad Sisters of Esi and how you kind of went about building this new world.
I love that you articulated that because I hadn't. And it is exactly in Mad Sisters of Esi, myth and magic perfectly intertwined in each other. I think I'm just really fascinated on why we make myths and what kind of power do they have in the real world? What kind of executionary jolt do they bring to the way in which we live? And so to me, myth and magic are very much entwined. But world building wise, I think that's a really interesting question because when I started Mad Sisters, I did the traditional world building. So I built out the world. I thought through all aspects of it. I had a 50-page Google Doc, most useless Google Doc in the world, but I had a 50-page Google Doc on, how everyone dresses, how everyone thinks, how the commerce works. And I think I realized through the process of doing that was entirely useless for me in the book I wanted to write, because the only world building that mattered is the world that my characters interacted with. It didn't need to be fully fleshed out outside of them. It needed to come to life when they interacted with it or when they communicated with it or when they touched it. And so I switched to what I call the John M. Harrison way of world building, which is essentially you write and your writing tells you how that world is formed and what that world is trying to say and what that world is. The world is in the language and in the choice of the language that you use. And then I just made sure that was consistent throughout the novel, because John M. Harrison doesn't state that you have to make it consistent, but it should be consistent. But that felt to me very much more in line with how I like to write, because I don't think you can separate world and language. I don't think you can separate story and language. Language is the building blocks of everything you do in writing. It is absolutely fundamental. And so using voice, using language, using perspective to build the world felt very correct and very natural.
This is a direct question about the Mad Sisters of Esi and, of course, The Liar's Weave. I'm assuming there are sisters in this because of the title. And in The Liar's Weave, one of the most central relationships is actually between two brothers. Is there something about the sibling relationship that keeps bringing you back to it?
Fundamentally, yes. Sibling and family relationships, I find, the love for a family is so beautiful and so complex, but yet such a cornerstone to how I understand my life, such a cornerstone to how I've shaped my identity. And also, interestingly, to how I understand Indianness, because I feel like it's very much unique to my country. And that may be a horrible generalization, but that's the sort of feeling that I get. And so I think I'm absolutely pulled and fascinated by the complicatedness of family relationships. So mother and sibling, father and sibling, father and son, and mother and son, and siblings themselves. And I think as siblings especially, I find really, really interesting, because you've grown up with someone who's your mirror image, who's your other half, who you are both like and not like at all, because you've shaped yourselves to be entirely different. And you're sort of wound together, but you both kind of reach that stage where you also choose the winding, because you can walk away from it. You can snap that bond if you want to. So at some point in your life, you start choosing it and you start leaning into it and you start fostering them as friends. And so beautifully complex and so beautifully rich. There's a line in the book that I absolutely love in Mad Sisters, where one of the characters says, "Sister is a special word. You have to be mad to love like that."
I want to build on this, but before we do that, I would like to ask you to summarize The Liar's Weave so we're not confusing listeners.
It's a book that basically asks a question of what happens if you can change reality with your lies. And so it's a boy in 1920s India who's essentially exploring the consequences of having this power. But this power has a catch to it. And that catch is you cannot see the effects of your lies. So if I lied that a box was blue, you would see the box was blue, but I would know that the box was brown, for instance. I would know what its true color was. And what I absolutely adored about The Liar's Weave is playing with that, like the complications of that, to have ultimate power and have absolute powerlessness at its core. It was just so much fun to write.
No, it does read like a book that was fun to write. The main character's name is Zahan.
Yeah.
His lies are kind of this ripple effect. And it's an enormous power, like the idea of you being able to change reality with words, to hand to a teenage boy, you know? The majority of the book is actually set at a time where he knows that he's different. He knows what his power is, but he doesn't actually understand consequences. And one of the things that I noted so strongly about this was that we are shown a moment of vulnerability where his lies have caught up to him. He knows that he can't do this indefinitely. He can't just keep lying indiscriminately. And his brother kind of comforts him, and at the same time facilitates this by being like, you know what we should do? We should write down every lie that you've ever told and keep track of them.
Mm-hmm. Siblings, huh?
Siblings. Like, truly, there was a moment where I was like, don't tell him that.
Don't give him intelligence. The one thing Zahan lacks was intelligence. And Saurabh had intelligence. His brother's name is Saurabh. And Saurabh had intelligence. It's like, right, let me give you my intelligence so that you can figure it out.
And I think throughout the book, you kind of understand that though Zahan has this great power, which he has absolutely no idea what the limits are and how to use it, Saurabh is kind of his grounding factor. And in a way, he kind of idolizes his brother and is always looking at him as the ideal person, right? Like Saurabh doesn't get into trouble. Saurabh's grades are good. Saurabh plays sports. Saurabh is so popular with people. And at the same time, you know, this guy who has this crazy power at his fingertips is a mess, a complete mess.
Yes, indeed.
And could you tell us a bit about Zahan and like, how did you come up with him? What was the kind of motivation behind him?
Oh, I love how you summarize that, because I think that was what, to me, was the central thing that was interesting about this main character. He's so much power and such uselessness attached to said power. He doesn't know what to do with it. Fundamentally, he doesn't know how to think it through. Fundamentally, he doesn't know how to protect himself. But most interestingly, and this is what I really loved about writing him as a character, everything he wants is so mundane. Everything he wants is such a human child thing to want, to be the popular boy, to be the loved boy, to be the boy who's seen as all powerful and all adored. Exactly, interestingly, as he sees his brother and that he believes his brother has already attained. So you take these very tiny, mundane, small wants that we all have to be the most special person in the room, the most incredible person in the room, and you give it this larger than life power that someone doesn't know how to hold and how to wield. And then you explore that relationship of that absolute power with what he wants to use that power for, and the powerlessness that engineers around him. Because a driving force in Zahan's life is, interestingly, to get his mother to be nicer to him. It is interestingly to get his mother to be honest with him and to talk to him. And she, on the other end, knows about his power and has known about his power all her life and is desperately lying to him to protect him and keep him within the bounds of what is safe. And I think that interplay I found really interesting between the tiny and the grand. The more his mother tries to keep him in the tiny, in the safe, the more he pushes out towards the grand.
And I think it's very much a domino effect here, because for one, as a teenager, your world starts to expand, and that's very natural, except this boy can warp reality, which obviously changes the whole flavor of the situation. But you're thinking of all these like backstories, like, for example, there's Tara Chand, who's actually my favorite character, just because he's obviously held this secret for so many years. Like, he spent his whole life, or rather all of Zahan's life, obsessed with Zahan's horoscope and wondering what the heck is going on, and is convinced that he's like, there is some celestial component here, whereas this boy is just trying to turn his like rag-made football into a real football. I mean, that is truly an example of small and grand, right?
Oh God, I love that. I just forgot how deeply flawed these characters are and how utterly ridiculous they are. I feel such a surge of love for them. Just to give some context to the readers, because I didn't do a great job of summarizing the Liar's Weave. The Liar's Weave is based in a world where your birth charts are real. So if you're Indian and you're listening in, you know what I'm talking about. But if you're not Indian, a birth chart is essentially a chart of the skies at the moment you're born. And they're essentially supposed to tell you when you'll get married, when you will die, what your fortunes will be, when ill health will come to you, what is your best year, what is your worst year. And the seed for the Liar's Weave was planted when I got my own birth chart done. And I've been fascinated with the future from a very young age, right? If the trajectory of my life is mapped out, is it better to know or is it better not to know? Like, what is the relationship between my knowing and the future actually playing itself out? And so the world of the Liar's Weave is created on this assumption that our birth charts are real and that everything that's given or written down at the moment of our births is exactly how it's going to play out. It won't change because basically your future is the god's past. It has already happened. You can't escape it, basically. Except for Zahan, who's the one anomaly in this entire huge world. And Tara Chand is the astrologer of these 7 universities, the Saptapuri universities, in charge of holding up the edifice of this entire world, and is just going slowly crazy. He's doing 500 birth charts instead of talking to the boy and figuring out what the human consequences of this power is.
And I think in a very real way, lies kind of power this whole world, because everyone is lying to Zahan. Zahan is lying freely because, like you mentioned, his mother knows from the very beginning that there's something really different about him. And she is trying to protect him, but at the same time lies to him, to the point where she's convincing this boy who's failed every math test that he's going to be an accountant. There's this whole world of people lying for their own needs. I mean, it's there in every world, but it has a kind of catastrophic effect here because Zahan is still a teenage boy. He's still liable to believe, he's a bit naive. He truly thinks that spaces where he's accepted, everyone will be accepted. So yeah, why lies? That's my question. I was building up to this, but yeah, why lies?
Oh, I'm fascinated by them. The idea, or one of the lines that form one of the backbones of the Liar's Weave is the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. And this leads to obviously the climax in the book or the last chapter in the book. But I'm fascinated by how lying is a technique we lean on often to make the world as we wish it to be. And we do it for many reasons. We do it for love, like Zahan's mother does. We do it for power, like Zahan does. We do it, again, for love and protection. And because your younger brother's an idiot, like Saurabh does. Like, there are many, many reasons why we lie. Or we lie because we cannot comprehend the reality in front of us. Like, Tara Chand lies to Zahan because he just cannot understand it. And he cannot claim or know how to explain to anybody how he cannot understand it. This whole book is powered by people engineering the world around them to make it as they want it to be. And yes, Zahan has the actual capability to do so, but actually he's the only person who suffers because he can't see the effects of his lies, whereas everybody else is lying to make the world as they want it to be and is kind of watching the effects. It goes wrong in many ways, but I found that impulse in us to reach for lies, to shape reality around us into something we can accept and something we can cope with and something we can live in or live with. Just fascinating.
I also wanted to ask about the world building in this book, because the setting of it is this kind of almost rigid social structure, because that's what we see with Tara Chand, who is this very learned, second best astrologer in the world, second only to his father. He has this big future ahead of him. Everyone expects him to be this big person in academia. And the contrast to that world where, if you're not from a certain family with like a background in this, you're considered an outsider.
So I feel like as I was growing up, everything felt loose and free and fluid and normal. And then as I grew up, there were a lot more rules and there was a lot more strata and society and interaction and ways of being that was still there while I was young and thought everything was fluid and nothing mattered. I just wasn't aware of it. So I think Tara Chand is the literalized version of that. Like he's at the highest of the high in the power hierarchies. Whereas I think Zahan, by virtue of being a teenager and by virtue of also being a child, doesn't necessarily notice the power hierarchies in his family or in the dynamics with the colony, because obviously the book doesn't go there. So I think Tara Chand is very aware of it because he knows his position. Zahan isn't aware of it because he's just all like, oh, I have a power. This is wonderful. I'm the best in the world. And then we obviously have Vidroha, which is this third section, which is where all the Hatay Deva live. And the Hatay Deva are the ill-fortunates, the people who are born with terrible birth charts and can do absolutely nothing to escape it. And they've kind of fled to this space in the forest, and they've created a carnival of sorts, basically, a grotesque carnival where they invert and they pull, and hierarchy means nothing, structure means nothing. They lean consistently every day into survival and into chaos because the world and structure and predictability has not been kind to them.
Vidroha is kind of like, I would say, a poisonous Eden. It's in a jungle kind of situation, and it's shown to be both cruel and nurturing. And what kind of inspired it as a physical space?
It is very much a poisonous Eden. It was based on the fact that reality itself has been so cruel to these people and has been so terrible to these people. They have created a space that's a sort of a homecoming for them, a space that's a refuge. But no space, when you've known that kind of cruelty or that kind of darkness, when your fates itself are so dark and you cannot escape them, can wholly do away with cruelty, because these people are hardened. They're also not very nice people. They've come to Vidroha with rage. They've come to Vidroha with hopes of retribution. And I don't blame them. The world has turned their back on them. And so the space itself, I wanted it to be a contrast to obviously the organized, cultured, I don't even think culture, just organized, rigid space that Tara Chand occupies. I wanted that chaos to be at the center of it. But I knew it couldn't just be a nurturing space, because that isn't the ethos of a lot of the people there. They're willing to fight for what they want. They're willing to fight to change their fate, as they should. I agree with that. And I can see that rage and that power has made dark things together.
And also, I think Zahan essentially doesn't understand, one, where they're coming from, because he is a naive teenage boy and he doesn't have their fate. Like, he doesn't have that misfortune hanging over him. So he kind of idealizes it. For him, it's a playground with people who are kind to him and, are his friends when he doesn't have that many in his regular life. And I think the turning point for him in the book is him trying to bring his brother into this and it ending very tragically. And it's also illustrative, I think, a little bit of the social order and the perversion of it. And also just this kind of assumption that children have of safety, which is not necessarily always the case. So could you tell us a bit about why you chose to go that way with Saurabh? And anyone listening, sorry, this is spoiler territory, but you've had 5 years.
You should know by now, yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the assumption of safety. I think Zahan doesn't really quite see the world clearly around him. I think he still thinks he's safe at all points in time because he's so protected and he's so sheltered, right? Sohrab does a lot of sheltering. His mother does a lot of sheltering. And I think by trying to bring Sohrab into that world, I was doing two things. One, I was doing what I thought Zahan would want, which is to take something super important to him and bring it kind of into that Vidroha world. But two, I was trying to introduce Sohrab's intelligence and Sohrab's understanding of the realities of the world and how dark it can be to that space, to that place where he just sees it, Zahan just sees it as nurturing and safe and beautiful and wild and wonderful and the best place ever. And I think it had to end the way it had to end because there is just no way Sohrab would have wandered into that world and told Zahan, "You're fine, this is great, oh my God, you found an Eden." I think he would very much have said, "This is a poisonous Eden, please stop. Very bad things are going to happen."
And also, I do have to mention that there is some positive, like rather some silver lining to his power, is that other people slowly begin to realize that they could change their lives as well, the trajectory of their lives. And Tarjan is the perfect example of this, where he's in his birth chart, it's written very clearly that this mortal will not marry, which, by the way, is like such a fancy way of saying this dude is not getting married. But he decides to take fate into his own hands. He decides that he's going to marry this woman. And against all odds, I mean, truly, I would have run a mile when he tells her the truth. She stays with him and loves him and supports him, which, I mean, again, wow.
She's a good woman. I wouldn't have done the same. She's a good woman.
Truly. And I think there is a lot to be said in this book about this kind of idea that you are the master of your own fate. And that seems to be the underlying thing that people are actually looking for, right?
I agree. I do feel like with Tarachan and his realization that because of the ripple effect that Zahan is having on the birth charts, this is a loophole. He can actually have this. I was really fascinated when he took it. I thought he'd be too much of a coward. I thought he would have run the other way and been like, "Sorry, I can't do this." But he very much wanted to take it. On the page, I was like, "Oh, missed opportunity." No, he was like, "Nope. Definitely want to marry this person. I will find a way to fake my birth charts in order to make this happen." And I love that for him. I love that he was able to realize that happiness is not always preordained and not always written, that sometimes it just has to be seized in whatever shape and form of surprise that it arrives in. And I'm so proud that he was able to do that. He got very lucky in Paranita. Like, I would definitely have run. She definitely stayed. But yeah, he got very lucky.
I mean, I was actually more surprised that he told her.
It is a very un-Tarachan thing to do, isn't it? He was very interesting as a character because when he started, he was very straight-laced and he was very created by his societal expectations. And I'll be honest, I wrote him assuming he will keep being straight-laced and keep being like sort of this foil to Vidroha. But I think he just kind of grew and got a life of his own and just got a bit more like, "Hey, I see happiness. I quite like that. I'll totally do anything to get it." And yeah, so I'm glad he took some good decisions.
I also wanted to ask you, but at the end of the book, Zahan essentially has to kind of escape his life and start anew. And he's given very strict instructions by Krishna and Tarachan to like not lie anymore. They're like, no more writing it down. Whatever you've lied about in the past has to stay in your mind and you cannot use your power anymore. How likely do you think that is? What do you think?
Oh, zero chance, like real zero chance. I think that he's got about 10 years of him remembering really clearly of like how horrible it was. And then I think he'll slip back into it. It'll be small lies first. He would be like, "This is not important, this is not important." Then it'll be slightly bigger lies. And then it'll catch up with him again and everything will go very badly.
On that optimistic note, I mean, I agree with you, but yes. I also wanted to ask if there are any themes that you find similar between The Liar's Weave and what you've explored in the Mad Sisters of Esi. Is there anything that you feel is kind of an extension of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are certain themes I circle around through different angles. One is the family relationships, so siblings, mother-daughter, father-daughter. But the second I think that I'm really pulled to is this concept of chaos or plurality. And I think it's finding different expressions. I think in The Liar's Weave, it found expression in Vidroha. In Mad Sisters, it's found expression throughout the entire book. In this new project I'm working on, it's finding very contained expression, but it's very much there in the form of magic and how magic can take the ordinary into wilderness. And I think the third theme that I circle a lot around, which is such a strange theme to be attracted by, power and powerlessness. I'm absolutely fascinated by that interplay between basically us consistently reaching for significance in a world that's designed to essentially emphasize our insignificance. I just find that interesting because I think it's just an essential human condition, isn't it? To try and reach for something larger than ourselves or make ourselves larger than ourselves while grappling with our inherent insignificance and powerlessness and how they interact with each other.
And before we sign off, I wanted to ask you if you have any new projects on the horizon, other than, of course, the Mad Sisters of Esi. When is that coming out, by the way?
That is coming out in September or October 2023. I was certain it was October. Now I'm not so sure. But we will have a date very soon. It's coming out from HarperCollins. It'll be available in the Indian subcontinent on ebook and bookstores online. And I've just, after 2 years of not writing anything, started a new book. And it's going slow, but it's going really, really well. And it's about women, again, and power and small art. So weaving and cooking and stitching and magic. And yeah, I'm just excited to see how it becomes.
That sounds fascinating because, everything needs a healthy dollop of magic, I think. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us today, Tashan. It was such a pleasure.
This was incredible. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. This was so much fun.
Arcs is a mini-series from The Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.